That's better. It stopped raining now. I'm inside. It's nice and warm and dry. The other children go home. We had to go down and take a look at our little friends before we do anything else, said Mr. Wonka. He pressed a different button and the lift dropped lower. Soon it was hovering just above the entrance gates to the factory. Looking down now, Charlie could see the children and their parents standing in a little group just inside the gates. I can see only 3, he said. Who's missing? I expect it's Mike TV, Mr. Wonka said, but he'll be coming along soon. Do you see the trucks? Mr. Wonka pointed to a line of gigantic covered vans parked in a line nearby. Yes, Charlie said. What are they for? Don't you remember what it said on the golden ticket? Every child goes home with a lifetime supply of sweets. There's 1 truckload for each of them, loaded to the brim. Aha, Mr. Wonka went on. There goes our friend Augustus. Do you see him? He's getting into the first truck with his mother and father. You mean he's really all right? Asked Charlie, astonished, even after going up that awful pipe. He's very much all right, said Mr. Wonka. He's changed, said Grandpa Joe, peering down through the glass wall of the elevator. He used to be fat. Now he's thin as a straw. Of course he's changed, said Mr. Wonka, laughing. He got squeezed in the pipe. Don't you remember? And look, there goes Miss Violet Beauregard, the great gum chewer. It seems as though they've managed to dejuice her after all. I'm so glad. And how healthy she looks. Much better than before. But she's purple in the face, cried Grandpa Joe. So she is, cried Mr. Wonka. Oh, well, there's nothing we can do about that. Good gracious, cried Charlie. Look at poor Veruca Salt. Mr. and Mrs. Salt. They're covered in rubbish. And here comes Mike TV, said Grandpa. Good heavens, what have they done to him? He's about 10 feet tall and thin as a wire. They've overstretched him in the gum stretching machine, said Mr. Wonka. How very careless. But how dreadful for him, cried Charlie. Nonsense, said Mr. Wonka. He's very lucky. Every basketball team in the country will be crying out for him. But now, he added, it's the time we left those 4 silly children. I have something very important to talk to you about, my dear Charlie. Mr. Wonka pressed another button and the lift swung upwards into the sky. There you go. Can you see all the children walking out? Look, there's Mike, Veruca Salt and her mum and dad, Violet and Augustus, all changed by what they did in the factory. Next chapter, Charlie's Chocolate Factory. The great glass lift was now hovering high over the town. Inside the lift stood Mr. Wonka, Grandpa Joe and little Charlie. How I love my chocolate factory, said Mr. Wonka, gazing down. Then he paused, and he turned round and he looked at Charlie. Do you love it too, Charlie? He asked. Oh, yes, cried Charlie. I think it's the most wonderful place in the whole world. I'm very pleased to hear you say that, said Mr. Wonka, looking more serious than ever. He went on, staring at Charlie. Yes, he said, I'm very pleased indeed to hear you say that. And now shall I tell you why? Mr. Wonka cocked his head to the other side, and all at once the tiny twinkling wrinkles of a smile appeared around the corners of his eyes, and he said, You are my dear boy. I have decided to make you a present of the whole place. As soon as you're old enough to run it, the entire factory will be yours. Charlie stared at Mr. Wonka. Grandpa Joe opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. It's quite true, Mr. Wonka said, smiling broadly now. I'm really giving it to you, Charlie. It's all right, isn't it? Giving it to him, grasped Grandpa Joe. You must be joking. I'm not joking, sir. I'm deadly serious. But why should you want to give your factory to Charlie? Listen, Mr. Wonka said. I am an old man. I'm much older than you think. I cannot go on forever. I've got no children of my own, no family at all. So who is going to run the factory for me when I am gone? I can't do it myself. The Oompa Loompas can't do it. Someone's got to keep it going, if only for their sake. Mind you, there are thousands of clever men who would give anything for the chance to come in and take over from me. But I don't want that sort of person. I don't want a grown-up person at all. A grown-up won't listen to me. He won't learn. He will just try to do things his own way and not my way. So I have to have a child. I want a good, sensible, loving child to whom I can tell all my most precious sweet-making secrets while I'm still alive. So this is why you sent out the golden ticket, said Charlie. Exactly, said Mr. Wonka. I decided to invite 5 children to the factory, and the one I liked the best at the end of the day would be the winner. But Mr. Wonka, stammered Grandpa Joe, do you really and truly mean that you are giving the whole of this enormous factory to little Charlie after all? There's no time for arguments, cried Mr. Wonka. We must go at once and fetch the rest of the family, Charlie's father and his mother and everyone else that's around. They can all live in the factory from now on. They can all help you to run it until Charlie is old enough to do it by himself. Where do you live, Charlie? Charlie peered down through the glass floor at the snow-covered houses that lay below. It's over there, he said, pointing. It's that little cottage right on the edge of town, the tiny little one. I see it, cried Mr. Wonka, and he pressed some more buttons and the lift shot down towards Charlie's house. I'm afraid my mother won't come with us, Charlie said sadly. Why ever not? Said Mr. Wonka. Because she won't leave Grandma Josephine and Grandpa George and Grandma Georgina. But they must come too. They can't, Charlie said. They're all very old and they haven't been out of bed for 20 years. Then we'll take along the bed as well, with them all in it, said Mr. Wonka. There's plenty of room in this lift for 5 for a bed. You couldn't get the bed out of the house, said Grandpa Joe. It won't go through the door. Don't despair, cried Mr. Wonka. No, nothing is impossible. You watch. The lift was now hovering over the roof of the Bucket's little house. Where are you going? What are you going to do? Cried Charlie. I'm going right in and fetch them, said Mr. Wonka. How? Asked Grandpa Joe. Through the roof, said Mr. Wonka, pushing another button. Through the roof? No, shouted Charlie. Stop, shouted Grandpa Joe. Crash went the lift right down through the roof of the house and into the old people's bedroom. Showers of dust and broken tiles and bits of wood, cockroaches and spiders and bricks and cement went raining down on all of the old ones who were lying in bed, and each of them thought the end of the world had come. Grandma Georgina fainted, Grandma Josephine dropped her false teeth, Grandpa George put his head under the covers. Mr. and Mrs. Bucket came rushing in from the next room. Save us, cried Grandma Josephine. Calm yourself, my darling wife, said Grandpa Joe, stepping out of the lift. It's only us. Mother, cried Charlie, rushing into Mrs. Bucket's arms. Mother, listen to what's happened. We're all going back to live in Mr. Wonka's factory, and we're going to help him to run it, and he's given it to me, and... What are you talking about? Said Mrs. Bucket. Just look at our house, cried poor Mr. Bucket. It's in ruins. Go look, there's the house, all broken. Oh dear. My dear sir, said Mr. Wonka, jumping forward and shaking Mr. Bucket warmly by the hand. I'm so very glad to meet you. You mustn't worry about your house. From now on you're never going to need it again anyway. Who is this crazy man? Screamed Grandma Josephine. He could have killed us all. This, said Grandpa Joe, is Mr. Willy Wonka himself. It took quite a time for Grandpa Joe and Charlie to explain to everyone exactly what had happened. And even then they all refused to ride back to the factory in the lift. I'd rather die in my bed, shouted Grandma Josephine. So would I, cried Grandma Georgina. I refuse to go, announced Grandpa George. So Mr. Wonka and Grandpa Joe and Charlie, taking no notice of their screams, simply pushed the bed into the lift. They pushed Mr. and Mrs. Bucket in after it. Then they got in themselves. Mr. Wonka pressed a button, the doors closed, Grandma Georgina screamed, and the lift rose up off the floor and shot through the hole in the roof and out into the open sky. Charlie climbed onto the bed and tried to calm the three old people who were still petrified with fear. Please don't be frightened, he said. It's quite safe, and we're going to the most wonderful place in the world. Charlie's right, said Grandpa Joe. Will there be anything to eat when we get there? Asked Grandma Josephine. I'm starving. The whole family is starving. Anything to eat? Cried Charlie, laughing. Oh, just you wait and see. That's it. That's the end of our book. Good, wasn't it? Hope you enjoyed the story. I'll see what I can come up with for the next one. Take care. Bye-bye.